Hello and welcome to our session. Today I am talking to Ethan Soloviev from HowGood, an organization that provides sustainability intelligence for food companies and also hosts the world's largest database on product sustainability. Today we're going to be discussing how organizations can accelerate environmental and social transformation in the food system and get into how CPGs can help to reduce scope 3 through sustainable sourcing. Ethan, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation, and maybe you can provide a brief update and background on yourself and anything more about HowGood as an organization.
Thanks for having me. My name is Ethan Soloviev, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at HowGood. I'm also a small-scale farmer in upstate New York, so I have about a 30-acre apple orchard, grass-fed sheep and lamb, shiitake mushroom operation that keeps me connected to the realities of agriculture on the ground around the world. At HowGood, I manage our innovation partnerships with some of the world's largest food companies. About 5 of the 10 largest food companies in the world work with our sustainability intelligence platform to understand the impacts of their ingredients, their supply system, and ultimately their products and how they communicate that downstream. We also work with retailers and ingredient suppliers to get a full picture end to end on sustainability data across the main categories that folks are interested in: carbon footprint, water usage, biodiversity, animal welfare, land use, labor risk. We track all of it in our holistic platform, which has 33,000 different ingredients, chemicals, and materials in it, and has assessed over 2 million products at the individual UPC level that are out there on the market.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I think, wanted to get into talking today about scope 3 emissions. We know that food systems account for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly as organizations, start to face increasing pressure around their role within climate, there's a recognition kind of across the value chain, everywhere from farmers to CPGs down to grocers, that they need to start thinking about, the strategies that they're employing to reduce their impact. But in the midst of that, rising inflation, growing consumption requirements for populations, it's a tricky issue and it's a hard problem to tackle. So I want to start with just talking about some of the pressures that you're seeing CPGs face on both the social and environmental side when it comes to their food supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, you have only to look at what's happened in the last 12 months to understand the significance, the importance, the severity of what we're facing right now. Because as you're saying, we're not just facing a climate crisis, which we are, we're also facing a biodiversity crisis. We're also facing a cost of living crisis. So it's actually, we're in a time of what you would call a poly crises, where there's many interacting and happening at the exact same time. And that's putting significant stress on supply chains and supply systems around the world. Not just from climate change-based disruptions to supply, but also from the geopolitical conflicts that are arising out of climate change. We're seeing more and more pressure on supply systems. Carbon is hugely important. We just have the most recent IPCC report out that basically paints a pretty dire picture of where we're at and the progress that has been made so far. But it also does something very important, especially for food and agriculture, which is that it elevates food and agriculture to a higher level in terms of its potential for addressing the climate crisis and addressing these interconnected polycrises. So just after wind and solar in terms of potential for mitigating climate change comes a number of agriculture and nature related solutions. Everything from reducing deforestation and land use change to capturing carbon in agricultural soils to restoring degraded landscapes around the world. Those are more impactful than changing out transportation fuels, than making more efficient buildings, way more impactful than the potential from carbon capture and storage in the time frame that we need. So agriculture is a nature-based solution. And the world is sort of looking at that and seeing now what a great opportunity to produce goods from agriculture, but also capture carbon, enhance biodiversity, and uplift human rights.
And I think we've started to see, players that are further down the value chain, such as CPGs, start to talk about, regenerative farming practices, think about their role within that value chain. And for those that have started to make some commitments that, this is a stronger focus for their organization, They want to implement more sustainable sourcing practices. Right now, what are the primary barriers that they're facing in order to, start to do that successfully?
Okay, well, I'm going to push back on two things to start that I think will help highlight what some of the challenges are. First of all, there's no such thing as a supply chain or a value chain. Chains don't exist in natural systems. And so when we say chain and we think in terms of a linear chain, we actually remove some of the possibilities and set up some of the challenges that we're having. Also, there's no such thing as regenerative farming practices. There's a huge number of agricultural practices out there. Some of them are beneficial in some places and not in others. So regenerative farming is a whole system that's focused on achieving outcomes. So those are two mental sort of high-level paradigm shifts that need to happen in order to address some of what companies are facing. So some of the challenges they're having, there just isn't enough regenerative agriculture supply of goods yet. There aren't enough low carbon wheats or cacao or blueberries or honey out there. It's just not, the demand is far outstripping supply. The company commitments to regenerative agriculture are far outpacing the growth, even though regenerative agriculture is growing quickly. So regenerative agriculture is the fastest growing agricultural movement in the world right now, and that's because it offers a huge number of benefits to farmers on the ground. But the pace of change that the world is asking for is going beyond what the current supply is. So what that is leading to is companies investing in their supply systems, collaborating between, from a CPG to an ingredient supplier with the farmers on the ground, whether that's smallholder farmers in the global south or global north, whether that's larger scale industrial agriculture farmers in Europe or North America or Asia. They're collaborating through these different coalitions to say, how do we accelerate change? How do we make regenerative farming happen faster? And there's some really exciting progress happening in that realm that I can speak more about.
Yeah, and I think that the, piece around the linear value chain versus, how organizations are going to have to engage with their stakeholders is a great point because, normally you'd have a chief procurement officer and how they, approach things, how they've done business in the past may not be, how organizations need to interact with their suppliers in the future. It's much more of an ecosystem, and you're bringing in also investors into that. You're bringing in potentially startups that have new technology. So there's a little bit, like you mentioned, kind of the word web or ecosystem. It's going to have to probably be more of that structure in order to scale some of these systems rather than,
Absolutely.
just your linear pathway that maybe historically, your model is set around.
Right, everybody had their cards tied to their chest. This is my supplier, my supply chain, and I've got it chained up, and only I can have it. No one else can have it. That's just not going to work for the future. The world is too interconnected now. It actually always was, but some of the way that we did that is some of what led to the challenges we're facing now. You can look at coalitions like the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is at least the Agribusiness Task Force. This has about 12 different companies, over 400 billion in revenue in those companies, who are coming together to address this collaboratively. And it's got CPGs, it's got retailers, it's got ingredient suppliers, and all are coming together to say, what do we need to do? The number one thing, and this is from a report that came out last year called Scaling Regenerative Farming, the number one thing is to agree on common metrics for measuring the effects of agriculture, especially regenerative agriculture. And the number two thing is to figure out how you get farmers paid for beneficial environmental outcomes. And then to the point that you made, one of the top 5 actions is we need to change how procurement happens. We need to, from the CPO down to the individual buyers at each company, needs a different set of models, a different set of frameworks, a different set of incentives that does not simply push for and incentivize lowest cost all the way down through the supply system. There needs to be a different way of approaching things. And now the Sustainable Markets Initiative is running a series of interconnected work streams to figure out how do you do those big 5 actions together.
And you talked a bit about, farmers and how to help them in this transition, because certainly there's significant risk. Sometimes there's a chicken and the egg piece around, being able to transition to different practices, but then having, the demand or investment to do that. So certainly investment sounds like, enabler. Are there other barriers that, you're a farmer yourself that you feel like the whole kind of ecosystems need to help support in order for farmers to be able to be comfortable transitioning into new practices or new ways of production?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to note is that farmers are brilliant intelligent, creative people. They're engineers, they're entrepreneurs, they're salespeople, they're marketers. They do so much on the farm, and many of them. This is why regenerative agriculture is growing quickly. Is regenerative agriculture does have benefits for farmers, right? So there is a decrease in input costs. All the academic studies have found that there is an increase in profitability for farmers who make the shift into regenerative agriculture. Many of those that are being studied have done that of their own accord over the last 20, 30 years. These are the innovators, the leading thinkers who are figuring out how to make that transition. Now, as we go to scale, there's a handful of things that the whole ecosystem needs to do together. We need to, one, help pay for the transition. Two, we need to de-risk the shift, especially the first 5 years of it. And so that can come through different forms of insurance, different forms of cost plus models. Danone is a partner of HowGood's. We don't work with them directly on this, but they have a really great cost plus model that they work with for dairy farmers. Longer term contracts are a huge part of that. Ultimately, the farmer should not be responsible for paying for the full transition. That should be held and shared probably more by the ingredient supplier, brand, and retailers, much more than it should be held by the farmers or by the end consumers. The other key thing that really needs to happen is some shifts in both the sort of social and intellectual space. Farmers want to learn from peers. They want to learn from other farmers. They need good technical expertise and input from specialized regenerative agronomists and folks who have experience in that space. So building up an ecosystem support that is financial, that is cultural and intellectual, and also ultimately it's social, right? You can't just invest in a single farm and get it to transition. You have to do work more like what General Mills is doing. General Mills, another partner of HowGood's, and doing incredible work in this space. They're investing in supply chains. They're investing in actual regions. They don't even buy from all of the farmers in that region, but they are helping grow a system of regenerative agriculture in that place. And so I think that's the sort of perspective that we need to come from. Holistic, multiple angles. Support comes from the higher margin businesses in the middle, ingredient suppliers, brands, retailers, as opposed to from the wallet crunched consumer, or as opposed to the already, in many cases, in a tough spot farmer themselves.
And I want to dig into the piece around the levers for kind of CPGs. You mentioned there working to set up systems, and I want to get your perspective on, how local this has to be, right? How specific do brands need to get when they're thinking about those kind of ecosystem strategies? And certainly they have goals at often a global level around their portfolio of products and their overall impact of their organization. But really, how local does the strategy need to be? And what implications does that have on how they go about that? Because, as we were talking about procurement and, that being a role that has typical ways of working, but as we're now getting into more ecosystem approaches, how does the organization need to think about how they interact, and do you need different models in different geographies to kind of do that effectively? So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that piece.
I wish I could say that there's just one simple, clear, singular set of things you could do that would work everywhere. But the world isn't like that. The world is diverse. The climate is diverse. Biology is diverse. Crops are diverse. Farmers are diverse. And so brands need to, and the ones that are being most successful are, I wouldn't quite go to the level of like full localization. I would say there's like a bioregional level that you need to be able to think at and look at. And you can look at, an ecoregion is a defined ecological term. And you could look at those ecoregions and look at the farmers who are producing, the farmers and ranchers, I should say, and fisher people, because they're all involved in this as well. But you do need to customize the approach to the particular regions that are most important that you're sourcing from, and start where you have the highest impact. This is one of the things HowGood's platform does, is it helps look across your whole supply portfolio, everything you're buying, and see where is my highest carbon footprint, where is my highest labor risk, and therefore where should I start to make some of these investments in evolving the ecosystem. But once you do identify those places, you really need to go in. There is a menu of options. It's not infinite possibilities. There's about 20 actions that we found, these are laid out in that Sustainable Markets Initiative report, that are different approaches, either with technical assistance or insurance. We mentioned, different forms of insurance, or paying premiums to farmers, or de-risking, investing in transition. There's a little, like, you can think of it as a palette, a painting palette. But for each of those, your company might need to learn how to do all of them, but then apply them differently in each place. And that should be a participatory process with the farmers, with the legacy support organizations, with the innovative startups that you mentioned in each place, to figure out what the mix is going to be that's going to work for that farming community. Smallholder rice farmers in India are going to look a lot different than apple farmers in New York or Washington, or potato farmers in the UK. And so figuring out the right bundle of economic, agronomic, ecological approaches to work with each supply shed, it's going to be important. And that's why companies have to collaborate. That's why when one company does the work to figure that out in a place, it behooves them and the farmers to have more collaborators throughout the supply system to help sort of double down on that, make that go further, make that really sustainable on the ground.
And are there specific capabilities that brands should be investing in order to kind of do what you just mentioned effectively? Whether it's skills, HowGood's certainly a platforming tool. So platforms, tools, skills, or ways of working even that you feel like right now there's a gap within?
Data. It doesn't have to be HowGood's platform, but you need data, and you need good data. You need granular, detailed data. It's not going to be, you're not going to get full primary data for every single farm in your system right away. That's going to take time. But you do need high level, really high quality data that stretches across the different impact factors. So 4 years ago, carbon was like, you should have been doing carbon, and the other stuff, maybe water a little bit. Now you got to have it for carbon, nature, and human rights. You have to have those three. And any platform that isn't kind of helping you look at the data for carbon and nature and human rights, you're just investing a little bit up the wrong alley. It's like a disservice to what's going to happen in the coming years with regulations. I think we'll get to that in a little bit. But the regulations are coming, and then the societal demand is coming that you have to be working on carbon, nature, and human rights, and you need data for all of those. I think the ways of working, we've already spoke to a little bit, like you got to be collaborative. You got to be collaborative with your upstream suppliers. You got to be collaborative and pre-competitive with your peers. You got to be collaborative downstream with retailers and all the way to consumers. Like that has to happen. I think some of the skills that are missing, we do hear that the need for really good on the ground regenerative agriculture resources, agronomists, ecologists, folks who can not just know the science, but have experience working with farmers and kind of like building up that capacity, either on your team or in a really detailed way with excellent partners for implementation. Those are two different paths you can go. Both are good and can work. So yeah, those I think are some of the key things that we see companies that are doing the best upscaling in.
Yeah. And I think, having data, even at a high level, really helps to narrow down the hotspots of where organizations can focus. Because I think, just like we saw within carbon, very quickly organizations can get overwhelmed about there's lots of actions I can take. They're usually very expensive. Where do I need to invest for my organization to really create the impact that I'm looking for? And I think having, even at a high level, understanding where those hotspots are, so you can start thinking at the product level and determining, like you mentioned, where which geographies you should be focusing, which product categories can help to narrow the resources. So even if you're an organization that is slowly scaling that investment, you can it just start to take some action around really what your biggest pain points are and hotspots are.
Right. Yes, and you also need data to be more fluid and enabled than it's been in the past. There's legacy databases out there that have a lot of kind of weight and industry standard behind them, but oftentimes they're not granular enough, and they require an expensive consultant to work them. And you can get some really great results out of that because you get a level of customization and fine-grained detail. In 6 months, you get a life cycle assessment for a single product you want to sell, and that's great, but often that report will sit on the shelf. It doesn't integrate throughout a company. And so what I mean by fluid is you need the data to be able to move from farm level up into the company to look at it at a procurement standpoint. So you can choose which farms, which suppliers am I going to work with, but then you need it to flow from there inside of an organization to the R&D teams so that they can formulate with it and innovate it in their products. And then it needs to flow to the marketing and sales teams so that they can make use of that good, sustainably procured materials to tell a better story that goes downstream to your customer. So within an organization, platforms that can integrate amongst various functions and teams with sustainability teams kind of watching and helping with all that is really, really key. Because otherwise you basically can't valorize the good work that you're doing with farmers in the regenerative agriculture system if you can't figure out how that goes into a product, and then you can make a claim that helps it sell more.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we could walk through the HowGood platform, because I think that would be a great way to be able to bring, some of this data to life and help organizations start to think about, what could this look like? What types of information, is valuable? And how can, they use that to make decisions within kind of sourcing. So that'd be great if we could dive in and take a look at some of the functionality there.
Okay, so this is HowGood's sustainability intelligence platform that gives insights into carbon, nature, and human rights. You can see here a number of products that a CPG might have. I'm starting at the R&D perspective so in order to understand how it works so we can see what we do in the procurement and marketing sides of things. Here's some products. We can see different aspects about them, like if they achieve a climate-friendly attribute, or we can look at what is the exact specific land use that it takes to produce that product in terms of area used. We can also drill into an individual product to see what its impacts are. We can see that in terms of a carbon footprint. We can see that in terms of different factors like an eco score used in Europe or a Nutri-Score. We can drill into the specific ingredients. Here's milk from the Northeast US. Here's a blueberry puree that has some other factors in it. And then we can make changes. So a formulator can go in and go to the milk and say, okay, what if it's not from the Northeast US? What if I'm getting, which has a 1.24 kilograms per kilogram carbon footprint? What if I'm getting from the EU? That actually makes it a little bit worse. Okay, what if we're going to get it from the Southeast US? That's also making it worse. So we can find a place that may have, here's a lower from Canada, a lower footprint that has also improved us on labor risk, though not so good in some of the other factors. But what if we do a certification? What if we make it a grass-fed? This is going to improve the greenhouse gas emissions, improves the biodiversity and labor risk. So now when we update this product, we see a number of improvements, and then the overall carbon footprint has actually gone down significantly, almost it looks like 35% by making a series of changes. This enables you to innovate across a whole portfolio and improve the impacts of products. But sometimes you want to go more granular. See here, there's a sugar. We're saying, well, what if I don't just want it from Honduras? Where's the best sugar from? To do that, you can go into the ingredient planning side of the platform and see, all right, where exactly would it make sense to get sugar from in order to have a lower carbon footprint? So here you can see sugarcane from a series of different locations with different greenhouse gas emissions for many of them. So then we can sort and say, okay, it looks like actually from Brazil, we're seeing a lower carbon footprint there. Would any certifications make that better? Potentially, we could, see some improvements. And then also you can look at the other factors, biodiversity, land use, soil health, and you might find some that are improved on the various factors. To get where you need to with sustainable procurement, here we can actually go into the procurement side of the platform. And in procurement, you move from a sort of product-centric view into an actual material-centric view, where you're seeing who are my particular suppliers of what exact materials, and how do we, what's our total carbon footprint, what's our total scope 3 emissions across all of the different materials that I'm purchasing. If I filter that down to just look at sugar, here it says some of the things that we're buying currently, but we can also look for new suppliers that we might not be buying from, who, if we want to see, let's just kind of focus in on carbon here. We can see a carbon footprint. This is a cradle to gate impact. So we can see some variation. If you turn on the materials directory here, this is adding thousands of new materials. We've got a bunch more sweeteners to pull from, some of which are going to have a higher and some a much lower carbon footprint associated with them. So then in the platform, you can go and actually switch over to a planning view where instead of just seeing what your current impacts are, we can filter down to sugar again. We can look at what we're doing, and then we can change our sourcing around. So right now, here's a beet sugar that's at a 0.91. We can see our total carbon footprint is 1.51 million metric tons of CO2 per year. If we move that value from this higher footprint beet sugar and switch it to one, here's a beet sugar from a different supplier that's almost half, and we switch it over, then we can see that our scope 3 emissions have gone down through that. And you can save this scenario and compare against a number of different scenarios so that very dynamically, whether it's carbon, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's human rights, you can figure out how to improve the impacts of your supply portfolio. And then that all translates back, if we go back to the yogurt we were looking at or another product we were looking at, a milk before, if you take that product that your R&D team is using, you can take all of this information and export a scorecard that actually compares your products to other products in the industry so that you can see, how are you doing? Where does this product score? What attributes can it achieve? And this gets used for marketing and sales conversations with retailers. So again, it's an end-to-end sustainability intelligence that shows how do we go from the good work that's happening in procurement through R&D all the way out to marketing and sales.
Great. Well, it's incredibly powerful. And I think, what's interesting about it is the ability to use it at those different purposes, right? It's not just a procurement tool. It can also add a lot of transparency and credibility to claims that organizations are making around product sustainability. And, I think we'll see a lot more regulation around having the data to back up your claims. So I think that, the tool is awesome. And I'm curious to know what's kind of the minimum level of data that organizations need to have to start to use it. And what does that kind of data maturity look like as they are able to collect more and more information?
It's surprisingly easy to have the basic data needed to produce a GHG protocol compliant, either scope 3 or product level footprint. Most companies already have the data that they need, which really is around what is the product, what are the ingredients, what are the countries of origin that they come from. If you have that information and a little bit more about your manufacturing, you can produce quite robust reports, but it still leaves room for improvement in terms of data granularity. So HowGood looks at and helps our partners with, and also just sees out in the world, 8 different levels of data granularity that go down all the way to primary farm data that's been modeled through a complex holistic model or a full life cycle assessment. Very, very few ingredients and products actually have it to that level 8 detail. But if you can go from level 1, which is where most folks start, to a level 4 or 5 pretty quickly, that is huge, and that will make you in good shape for all of the upcoming regulations, whether that's the SEC draft rule that's coming out on carbon, whether that's the European CSRD, whether that's some of the new the Canadian human rights risk laws, a lot of the regulations that are coming up. And then there's all the voluntary program, Science-Based Targets for Nature, CDP, all of those require also a good degree of granularity. So if you can get the basic data in, that covers you for your basic reporting. But then when you find out where your hotspots are and where you're investing in your supply system to improve, then you can go get more granular data. And so over time, all companies at each point in the supply system will have more and more granular data. That's the kind of competition I like. I like competition on decarbonization and data transparency. And I think that's the sort of spirit that many companies are working in, and more should be.
And I think the demand is coming from many factors, right? There's regulation, like you mentioned, but investors are looking for information. Customers who want to do their own reporting, that's the complexity and beauty of scope 3 is everyone's kind of in it together. In order to have good data for your customers, you have to have good data from your suppliers. So, that has ripple effects across organizations. So maybe just to close off, would be awesome to hear kind of an example of how you've used this with a client partner. What's an example of impact that it's made that's got you really excited about the possibility of the platform and what it can be used for?
Great. Yeah, and I'll just, before I do that, there's one other piece to add to where the pressures are coming from to do this, Yes,
Yeah.
there's regulation. Yes, there's investors. More and more LPs are pushing on this. Yes, it's coming from customer demand in terms of retailers, but then all the way to consumers.
Mm.
Millennials and Gen Z, who are the largest purchasing power in the world now, they want this information. They want this transparency. They don't want a certification checkbox that says, oh, I'm done. You don't need to think about this. They want to know the story. They want to know how hard it is. They want to know how they can help. They want to see the depths of complexity because they know that it's actually that hard. So all of the data from Nielsen, from IRI, the data is showing that more sustainable products sell better in the marketplace. So this is not like a cost center. This becomes an ROI center for the businesses that take it on because you're actually seeing higher sales of more sustainable products. I'll give two quick examples of little case studies. One is smaller scale, a company called Whiteleaf Provisions, really pushing the edge of regenerative agriculture, organic, high quality products. They're a startup, they're very quickly growing. They used our platform to understand the impact of their products and then to benchmark against their competitors in the industry. And then they took that into conversations with their retail customers and were able to quadruple sales in some pretty important retailers through showing that same sustainability scorecard export that you were looking at in the platform. On another scale, I can point to one of our partners who's been quite public with our work together, and that's a restaurant, actually, in this case, which is Chipotle. So Chipotle has thousands of stores around the world, and they have done some incredible work in their understanding of their supply system and working to have food with integrity in their food. They built with us an actual calculator that every single time you order online, you order a burrito or a bowl or whatever, it tells you the carbon impacts and the carbon savings you're having by working with them and by purchasing their goods, their grass-fed beef, their organic beans and cilantro. It shows you the water saved, it shows you the square feet of organic land supported, and that literally comes at the bottom of every digital receipt that Chipotle sends. So all of their customers, all over the world, can see what is the impact that I'm doing, and then it saves up so they see their impact build over time. So that's an example of looking back into the supply system, but then valorizing the incredible work that they've done for a really long time into a place that consumers can see it, get value out of it, and build a greater trust and love of the brand that's doing really excellent sustainable work in the world.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, and I think consumers want to be able to take those chances to reduce their own impact. And in many cases, there's a willingness to pay for that. But what they're getting for it has to be clear, right? Like you said, it can't necessarily be just a certification that you have no idea what went into that, what actually the implications are, but really being able to quantify things by certain dimensions and attach that to a product, provides an incredible story and then ability to be able to kind of take credit for all the investments that are made all the way upstream.
Yeah, and you need good data all the way along to prove that and to defend it.
Yeah.
And we're seeing more and more, companies having to legally defend the claims they're making, especially with the new European draft green claims law coming out. You gotta have your data in good shape. You need a dynamic platform to measure that and to have it integrated through the company. You don't want the legal team to have to get in there and use it, but if they have to, you really want to have it in place in order to do sustainable procurement and get your ROI from doing that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ethan. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. The platform is really, really exciting. So thanks again for the conversation today.
Thanks for your great questions and for bringing this work out into the world.